I would say the original text, at least the one I have from your website, was bad enough with the word government and the word enforcement, the famous point 38 on the page 19. But in which direction is the text changing,
right,
as you see it? This is my one question. And another, how do the delegations, if you ask them, how do they react to the text and to the implications?
Right. The rule in conferences like this is that the actual delegates have almost never read the treaty. The only exception to this rule, in the many treaties that I have drafted and negotiated and interpreted, was the Anglo-Irish agreement between Margaret Thatcher and Garret FitzGerald back in the mid-1980s when I was working for Margaret Thatcher. And that treaty was 1.5 pages long, and both sides had read every word of it, because any proper international treaty should be a short, clear declaration of principles and nothing more. And instead, whenever you get a long, rambling, diffuse text like the 186 pages that they started with, then you know that what's happening is that the generally very lazy but fairly senior bureaucrats who act as the negotiators for individual nations will not bother to read a long draft. They will let junior officials read it, if that, and often nobody reads it. And that is how these details, like how to set up a world government, how to have all these interlocking bureaucracies established, how to impose enormous taxes on aviation, on shipping, a tax of 2% of gross domestic product on every Western country. That, for the United States, to take one example, would be the equivalent of half its defence budget, confiscated by this lunatic new government every year. A 2% tax on every financial transaction into or out of a Western country, which would close down the Western financial system, and indeed is more or less intended to do that. The subjugation of all world markets that were formerly free markets to the new government to regulate them as it wishes. All of these things are still in every draft of the treaty. And no attempt has been made by most of the Western countries to take any of this out. Why? Because they haven't read it.
This sounds incredible. I think, I would expect fairly intelligent people coming to such meetings, and some of whom having a modicum of patriotism. But from what you are saying, it looks like it's sailing. What we say in Denmark, it's just sailing. How do they react to your words?
I'll give you an example, first of all, of how easy it is, even for senior politicians who really ought to know better, to fail to read a long treaty. When the Treaty of Maastricht was being negotiated, I was then writing for one of the London evening newspapers, and I obtained, I'm good at this, the first publicly available copy of the draft Treaty of Maastricht in Britain, because the Foreign Office were keeping it secret, all the political parties were keeping it secret, the people were not being told that the entire British Constitution was going to be thrown in the bin, and we would in future be governed by commissars, as the Germans call them, who are unelected and whom we cannot call to account or question. We can't remove them, we can't replace them, we just have to salute and obey. They now make 90% of Britain's laws thanks to that treaty. And I read this document with horror. I revealed its contents in the Evening Standard, for which I was then writing. And in particular, I said that yes, there is a European Parliament, yes, it is elected, but it does not have any powers actually to decide legislation at all. It can't propose any legislation, and if it decides legislation, its decisions can be overridden at will by the commissars. And if it wishes to amend legislation, then its wishes can be overridden, and routinely are, by the commissars. And these provisions were in the draft Treaty of Maastricht. And when I revealed this and I said, this is the end of British democracy, only a few decades really after it was fully established that everybody could have the vote, now it's all been taken away again. And the then Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, who was not a stupid man, but he was the man in charge of the negotiations for that treaty. He wrote an angry letter to the Evening Standard saying he knew of no provision in the Maastricht Treaty that said that the decisions of the European Parliament on voting on legislation or on amending legislation could be overridden at will by the commissars, who were unelected. So I wrote to him and I said, there are in fact 5 separate provisions in the Maastricht Treaty, 1 general catch-all clause and 4 others, which make this explicitly plain. It is stated in terms that the European Parliament doesn't have the final say, that the unelected commissars do. And he had simply not read the treaty that, as Foreign Minister of Britain, it was his job to negotiate. And he signed that treaty never having actually read it. So this happens even at the most senior level in government, even over the most important of treaties, in this case a treaty to sign away Britain's democracy forever. Our democracy has now gone. We are now a police state governed by an alien authority somewhere else over which we have practically no control whatsoever, and all of this because the minister concerned did not read the document that he signed on behalf of Her Majesty. And so this happens all the time, and it's happened here again. Until I pointed out that they were trying to set up a world government, nobody even knew. None of the negotiators for the individual countries knew, because they hadn't bothered to read the small print and see that buried in paragraphs 36 to 38 of Annex 1, here was the proposal for a world government. No, they hadn't read it, they hadn't bothered. And it's the same when they get here. They go out to cocktail parties, they meet groups of fellow delegates to discuss this, that and the other, but very few of them actually get down to reading what the text says. And the UN's bureaucrats know this, just as the EU's bureaucrats knew it when they were drafting what became the Treaty of Maastricht. They knew that if they made it long enough, nobody would read it, they could put in anything they wanted, and they could get away with it. And they've done it again this time. There's a long history of this. If you go back to the Dover Public Street Works Act of 1898, which was an act of the British Parliament to allow the Dover Corporation to dig up the roads and put in drains. And for that, in those days, you needed parliamentary permission. In the middle of this act, buried in a schedule to do with filter beds and filtration and drainage and sewerage, was a single subclause that simply said, and the town clerk's marriage shall be dissolved. Of course, nobody had read the legislation. It was passed by Parliament, and the town clerk, who hated his wife, and in those days you couldn't get a divorce, he got his divorce because it was there in the Dover Street Works Act 1898. The trouble came along when the next town clerk, who was happily married, took the job and didn't want his marriage dissolved, which automatically happened the moment he became town clerk of Dover. So you can see how important it is that one should read these documents very, very carefully. But unfortunately, at these conferences, in my experience, it never happens. And it is astonishing, after several negotiating rounds, that proposals for a world government remained in that treaty until I spotted it and called it out 2 months ago.